Hello to all my viewers, this is Magicalamazing, and today's video is going to be on how I made my Cardboard FP-45 Liberator. This gun functions the same way internally as the real one in terms of actions and moving, so even though it might look simple on the outside, it might be a little bit tricky to get everything to work properly. With that in mind, it took me a couple tries, so the footage you're about to see is going to be from a couple different attempts, so if you notice any slight differences in parts of the guns, that's why. The overall process of building it, however, remained fairly consistent. Now I suggest you watch the whole video start to end before you even start to attempt to build this, because you will get a better idea of how everything works and how everything's meant to go together. It's better to know all of that before you just start making parts and none of them work or fit. So without further ado, let's get started. The first step, like always, is to draw a full-scale picture of the gun on a piece of paper. I cut out the top part of the side panels of the gun, which is going to enclose the actual mechanism, followed by cutting out the bottom part of the gun, which will be the wider grip area. To contour the grips, I started by removing the corrugation from the top part there so that I can pinch them together and taper them. As you can see, the length and angle of the tapers on my parts are not exactly the same, but it doesn't really matter because you're only going to be seeing the gun from one side anyway, and therefore only seeing one side panel at a time. I then proceeded to use a similar technique to pinch the front and back of each panel as well. I cut out this shape from stiff, uncorrugated cardboard to use as a stencil or template when I glued the tops to the bottoms of the side panels to make sure that they stayed aligned and were in the same orientation. I then removed the corrugation and pinched the top of the inside of the top parts, which is going to allow the barrel to come a lot closer to the edge of the gun. I did this on both sides. Next, I made the barrel, which is a rolled up piece of paper that I layered a few times for thickness and strength. This little end part here, made of layered cardboard, is going to be glued to the end of the barrel like this. It's the same width as the barrel and just drops down. The thicker part of the barrel, around the chamber, is going to be made of a part like this, which I'm going to remove the corrugation from where you see here and bend over the top of the barrel like this. I'm also going to cut out a pattern like this and trim the whole thing down so that once it's attached, here's what it looks like. I've also covered the corrugation of the top of those little wings. Next, I'm going to make this very tightly rolled piece of paper and wrap a strip around it to make that bump on the end. That bump is going to be what the sear interfaces with to hold the striker back until you pull the trigger and drop it. By far the toughest part of this whole thing was making these two plates, which are just layered cardboard. The hard part is getting the holes to line up in just the right way. In these next couple clips, I'll show you how that's supposed to work. Noting that while I'm doing this demonstration, the paper rod is not in the position it's going to be in the finished gun. It acts the same way, and it's easier to see this way, so I'm going to show you like this. The plate I just put on is the breech plate, and this is just a back cover. And here's how all of the holes line up. The top one is for aligning the striker. The one in the way right there that I'm looking through is for the firing pin, and the bottom one is for the paper rod I just made. When the rod is run through those three plates, you can see that when I pull up on the breech plate, the upmost position lines up the big hole in the breech plate with the chamber and would allow me to drop a cartridge in. Here's what might be a little bit of a better view with the back cover plate off. I'm going to show you again with the paper rod here, not in the right orientation, but for ease of showing, this is how it's going to be here. You can see when I pull up, the bottom of the slot I cut from the hole in the breech plate is going to hit the bottom of the pin as soon as the hole lines up with the chamber. After gluing on the back plate, but not the breech plate, do not get any glue on the breech plate, I made this piece here to cover up the back and make it look a little bit nicer. I then made a piece like this that fits around the barrel to be the trigger guard. It's also going to be an important part of the action, so you do need it to be as big as it is here and go all the way to the back of the grip. The width of this strip also sets the width of your gun, so make sure that the width is exactly what you want and not too big or small. Here is a little layered piece of cardboard with a hole drilled through it, which is going to act as the stop for the bar, and here you can see how that's all going to be put together. You can see now the position of that paper rod and where the ring is that I made earlier. It's going to be acted against by that pen spring that's wrapped around it there. Because of the options of springs that I had, this was the only one that would work, and it was a little bit too short, so I had to make a paper spacer. But if you can find the right size spring, there's really no need for it. To start work on the trigger, I made these two pieces, which will be the side panels of the trigger, and then connected them together with a thin strip of uncorrugated cardboard. Now it's important to note that this needs to fit inside your gun between the two side panels, as well as the gap in between it needs to be large enough so that you can fit the paper rod through there, which will all become clear in a little bit when you see the whole mechanism. I cut a small notch out of the top corner there and made a paper pin for the trigger to pivot on, as well as drilling a hole through which will be connected to the sear. Speaking of the sear, that's going to be another piece of cardboard which is layered and put together, and it looks a bit like this. This is going to take trial and error to get this shape right and a lot of fitting, but here's what mine ended up looking like. I also made a pin which is just as wide as the trigger is, which will go through the hole in the trigger and through the hole in the sear to allow it to pivot. It's important to make sure that when you do this, the sear has a wide range of free motion to pivot up and down, because it's going to need to do this to be able to catch and release the striker. Here I've taken the whole barrel assembly, and I'm going to make sure that nothing gets hung up, and again that it works and stops in the right place and that everything's aligned. You can see on the inside of the side panel I have relieved where the trigger guard and this whole thing will go. I did this for both sides, and this will allow a little bit more stability to the mechanism, as well as keeping the gun the right width and making sure that the barrel is inboard the right amount from the outsides of the gun. Notice that the chamber, thicker part of the barrel does actually overhang out past the side panel a little bit. Lastly, I also drilled this hole right here through both sides, which is going to be what the trigger pivot pin rides in. This is how these parts are going to be working together and how they all line up. Here you can see why that trigger needed to be as open on the inside as it did, and why that pin needs to stick through it, because it does. Here, basically what I'm doing is showing how I'm fitting the whole thing together and making sure everything lines up and nothing hits or binds. This is something I had to do many times to trial and error my way into making these parts the right shape. In this clip, I added a spring to the bottom of the sear, and I'm going to attempt to show you how this mechanism works, but it's kind of finicky without both side panels on. I also had to add this spacer to the top of the trigger, which is going to hit up against the bottom of the barrel to stop the trigger from going too far forward. After messing around for a considerable amount of time and getting everything lined up and in place, this is kind of how the whole thing is going to work. Here you can see the newly spring-loaded sear, and it is being pushed up by this spring. It's wedging itself on that plate that I put there to hold the rod earlier, which is keeping the trigger forward. When you pull back on the striker, which is attached to this rod, it's going to snap back and over the sear, which should be cammed down by that surface and allow it to fall forward, which is, again, kind of hard to show without the other side panel on, but it does work. Here's a bit of a better view of the mechanism in the fired position. I also added a small paper peg to the bottom of the trigger guard, which you can see attached to the spring on the sear, which basically just stops that spring from doing what it did in the previous clip and skating all over the place and basically stopping it from jamming. I then layered these two tiny pieces of cardboard, which are going to act as the clips which hold on the sliding bottom plate of the grip where you would keep your ammo. They are bent into this rigid L shape, which is going to allow them to be both thin and strong enough to hold on the plate. Here you can see I have removed a little bit of the corrugation from the bottom of the grips and glued these two L shapes in. Next, the moment of no return, I glued on the two side panels. I basically committed here. There's no good way to get them off and fix anything if it doesn't work at this point. So here we go, the true test. Will I get a click and lock back? Next, I'm going to cover the gap between the side panels of the gun on the back and front of the grips using strips of uncorrugated cardboard. Here you can see where I did that. Notice I left the bottom open because that's where the rounds are going to be stored and covered by the grip plate. Here you can see I have covered the corrugation and gap in the trigger guard and around the trigger, where you can see here, and I've also made the flat plate in the shape that's going to be for the bottom of the grip. I'm just going to shove it in there to make sure that it's the right shape and size, and then I'm going to work on the details and the thickness of it in just a second. Here I added another layer to it to make it brown on both sides and also allow it to get that little bend on the end there. To add the flared upper section of the side panels of the gun to account for the thickness of the chamber area of the barrel, I cut out these two shapes and glued them on where you see in this video. The striker started out as these pieces here, with the cardboard pieces being glued side to side for the body of the striker, and the top bit there is the guiding arm for sticking through the breech plate where you see there. It's important to make sure that you have the right height and it slides freely through that hole, because otherwise it'll get hung up when you try and release it. I added a little bit of thickness to the striker by adding a couple plates to either side, as well as covering the bottom, and it can easily slip over the paper rod and still fits correctly. It should be just thick enough to fully take up the space between the two side panels in the back there. Here you can see I covered the top of the corrugation of the added side reinforcement, as well as draping a piece of uncorrugated over the top. The last bit of detail to the striker is going to be this piece here, which I'm going to wrap around the back of the striker, as well as cut a little bit of a radius on the bottom and cover the corrugation on the top and the bottom as well. I've also added the firing pin. And here's what the gun looks like with the striker attached. I just glued it directly onto the paper rod that's running through the whole gun. Once again, I'm testing the fit up of everything, though at this point there really isn't much I could do if it doesn't work, but I'm just making sure anyway. When you pull back the striker, it catches on the sear, and when you pull the trigger, or push it in this case, it drops. To finish the look of the gun, I cut out all these details in the shape of a bunch of circles and squares of uncorrugated cardboard, and here's you can see where I put them all. I also cut a couple holes in the side of the gun where they should be. And with the last few details in place, I was done. Now, I'd like to reiterate that this did take me a couple tries, and by the end of it, I honestly never really came up with anything that could ever be considered an actual plan. It was really only from my previous failures to understand what needed to work with what and what needed to fit and how that I ended up finally with a working mechanism. So if you took my advice and watched the whole video through before starting, I hope that some of my views and descriptions and videos helped you understand better how the mechanism works. So thank you guys for watching, good luck building, and this is Magical Amazing, signing off till next time. See y'all later.